Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Sargent, and this is my take on the American Civil War. What does the American Civil War have to do with conspiracies at all? I mean, it was a straight up American war, right? Don't believe it really anything that you hear in the mainstream media or in the history books. There was something that George Carlin said which really spoke to me, which was he goes, I don't have a lot of rules, but there's one thing, one of the first ones I follow is I never believe anything. And he repeated that anything the government tells you. So when they tell you exactly why the war, it's not just this war, but any war was fought, and we'll cover all the wars before it's over, I'm sure. Uh, why this war was fought? No. It was fought for certain reasons that they don't tell the public because they don't want to upset anybody. So, and you'll find this out. And I'm looking at the giant Wikipedia entry on this. We'll read a couple paragraphs, just to give you a breakdown of exactly what we're talking about. But we're not going to go into it very into any depth because, well, it makes no difference because the war itself was fought for completely different reasons. Everyone knows, and we'll get into this. If you go through school, especially in the United States, that it was fought over slavery and secession and money. No, it was more than that, and we will dig into that starting right now. So, the wiki entry says the American Civil War was a civil war fought from 1861 to 1865 to determine the integrity of the United States of America as it defeated the bid for independence by the breakaway Confederate States of America. Among the 34 states in January of 1861, 7 southern slave states individually declared their secession from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. War broke out in April of 1861 when they attacked a United States fortress, which is known as Fort Sumter, Sumter, and ended with the surrender of all the Confederate armies in spring of 1865. The Confederacy, known as the South, grew to include 11 states. It claimed 2 more states and several western territories. The Confederacy was never diplomatically recognized by any foreign country. The states that remained loyal, including border states where slavery was legal, were known as the Union or the North. The war had its origin in the factious, I never use that word, issue of slavery, especially the extension of slavery into the Western territories. 4 years of intense combat left 750,000 soldiers dead and destroyed much of the South's infrastructure. The Confederacy collapsed and slavery was abolished in the entire country. The Reconstruction era, 1863 to 1877, overlapped and followed the war with its fitful process of restoring national unity, strengthening the national government, and guaranteeing civil rights to the freed slaves. Happy, happy, happy. It's a wonderful story. That's what we teach. It was all about slavery. The South had slaves and the North didn't. The North wanted to do the right thing. And yeah, you can buy that if you want. I had a history teacher. His name was Tom Felgar, and he was really adamant about this. Out of all the subjects, this one really kind of rubbed him the wrong way. Where the history book said it was always about slavery. Basically, you boil it down to one word. Was the South and the North? Why did the American Civil War? Because of slavery. One word. And it's like, oh yeah, we were doing the right thing, freeing the slaves. And if you want to look into it a little deeper, you can say, well, it was about money because slavery was free labor, and the South had it and the North didn't. But the North had all that industry. So why would they necessarily care about the South and the freed slaves? They didn't. This wasn't even about money though. It was about something much bigger and much older than that entire war, and that was the British, the United Kingdom, Great Britain. It was their last and best shot at taking the United States. They wanted it. They had wanted it for a long time, and they weren't. You think they're going to give up after this one round? No, of course not. So let's review real quick, what we know about the wars so far. Great Britain initially tried to take the colonies. Remember, the colonies were founded by a lot of British people to begin with. Tried to take them during the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War was not about the colonists and the British. It was about the British and the French, the old rivalry that was never ever going to die. It was always, again, always about the British and the French and the Spanish. It was those three going round and round. And so when the new territory came out, that new land that everybody wanted, the British wanted it and the French wanted it, and everybody knew they were going to go to fight over this sooner or later. But they brought in the colonists, and it says, oh yeah, the colonists kicked them out. It's like no, it was those ex-British people over there in the colonies were didn't have nearly enough power to kick the British out. It was the French Navy, the French Army. They were all over it. And when that ended, and the British went home and went packing, they weren't done because again the old rivalry. These guys have been squaring off and trading blows for centuries. And so they decided they were going to try to come back and take the New World again. So they sent an expeditionary force during what's now going to be known as the War of 1812. I'm not going to really cover it too much. We'll just cover it briefly here, which was, they sent an expeditionary force northeastern United States, and they marched, the British marched a force all the way down to Washington, D.C. with almost no resistance. They attacked and burned the White House down. Just like that. It was so easy. They basically took the capital right then. I mean, they had the states. All they had to do was send more men. They didn't have enough men to hold the ground. So the British decided to go back to England, and they said, okay, well, since we did that, what else can let's make sure the French don't get involved this time. And at that point, if you even know your history, Napoleon was involved, and they said, okay, we got to take care of Napoleon. Once we take out Napoleon, the states are ours. And I'm not saying that Great Britain necessarily got greedy, but they did. That's what they were going for. It's like, okay, we got to make sure we got America this time. So let's take Napoleon, take out the French forces over here, and then when we go over to America, we're not going to get they're not going to have support, and we should be able to take the whole thing. And that's exactly what they tried. So the Battle of Waterloo with Napoleon, and it went very, very well. Now, it weakened the British forces somewhat. So it's like, okay, so now they had a weaker force to send over to America. And, America's watching this whole thing. Granted, the communication lines weren't very fast, but they were watching this whole thing. And that's where, it's like, okay, so America had some time to prepare. The colonies had some time to prepare. And their information was good enough that they realized that they weren't going to come in through the north, they were going to come in through the south around New Orleans. And then happened the Battle of New Orleans, where a fine American general, Andrew Jackson, who is also on the $20 bill, he set up a strong defense. The weather helped, the conditions helped, the terrain helped, and they stopped the British down at the Battle of New Orleans. And that was it. The War of 1812 was pretty much, that was it. The British had to pull back again, and so they were close. They were closer than they were, in my opinion, the first time, because again the Americans didn't have any reinforcements. Andrew Jackson, because of that battle, and ended up becoming president of the United States, and then being put on the $20 bill. But here's where it gets interesting. So after that, the British knew. It's like, okay, we were close this time, and we've attacked in the south, we've attacked in the north, and we've got a pretty good idea of the terrain and everything that's going on. So this is 1812. Let's they basically had one more shot, because if they waited too long, the United States would have grown to a certain size and population, of a couple more generations, and Great Britain wouldn't be able to do much against them anyway. So what they did was they created dissension in the ranks. And what I mean by that was they saw the division that was happening, where the slave owners in the South were growing, and they were gaining a lot of money, and they had a decent population. Now there was a lot of industry in the North, but there was this division, this lifestyle division, this doctrine between the South and the North, and the British saw that, and so they really cultivated it, and they went to the South. And again, you can look this up in books. This is not hard to find. They had advisors. They set the whole thing up. They wanted the South to go to war because they were going to get involved. Think of it. It's a perfect scenario. The South, eventually secedes from the Union. Right? They pull out, and they say, okay, we want to form our own country. But that wasn't the point at all. The British at that stage had set everything up. They had already equipped the South with all the weapons and the ships that the South needed. If any doubt of that, look up one of the greatest little examples is the Confederate sloop of war, the CSS Alabama, which was a ship that was built by the British. They trained the British trained the Southern Army personnel on how to use it. In fact, they even left a British cook in there. I don't know why you would use a British cook instead of a Southern cook. You couldn't find a decent Southern cook. I think Southern cooking is probably better than British cooking. That's just my opinion. And that ship just it took a whole bunch of ships during the war. The point was the British were ready to go because if the British would have gotten involved in the Civil War, it would have been a completely different war because then you have the South and the British, mostly the British Navy. They didn't have to send ground troops necessarily. The British Navy to fight the North, and that would have been a really, really different war. It wouldn't have been the North versus the South. It would have been the North versus the South and the British, and that war wouldn't have ended in 5 years or 4 years and change. Not a chance. That war would have taken a while, and 750,000 dead. No, there would have been a lot more than that because the British had it cinched up either way. So we'll play out both scenarios real quick. Let's say the North wins, but because the British Navy is involved, they have a lot more casualties, and the damage to the North, the damage to the infrastructure of the North, is much more extensive. If the South and the North go to battle and the North wins, well, then the British have a chance to move in. They come in through the South. At that point, wait till the very last minute. They send their infantry in, come in through the South, and a very weakened North, and the North would be on its heels. It would have a really really tough time. Or you take the other stance, and that is they back the South, and the South wins, but the South is so decimated again because the North and the South, they were so equally matched in terms of infantry. There would have been a huge body count, and then the South comes in and says, "Oh yeah, we'll help you, with your infrastructure. We'll help you set up. Oh yeah, by the way, we're going to be occupying some lands," and then they'll run dual flags, and then that's it. The British basically annex the South because the South has no resistance. It was perfect. And why would the British Navy, why would that plan have worked for for the British? It would have worked because the whole point was they knew they could bottle up the eastern seaboard. Meaning, if you watch some of the movies that are out there, depicting the Civil War, it was no joke. The North really had an advantage when it came to infantry because any immigrants, because remember, even though the Civil War thing was happening, there were a lot of people still coming to the United States, and all the immigration ports were in the North, in New York and Philadelphia and Washington State. They were all up there, and so people were getting off the boats literally, at one of these ports in the North, and then they were being recruited heavily, I mean strong arm recruitment, to join the military. It's like, hey, you got off the boat, we'll give you a job, we're going to give you a home, we'll give you money, we'll give you a signing bonus. All you have to do is survive the war. We'll even pay insurance out to your next of kin if you die. Sign on the dotted line. They give them a uniform. They put them back into a different boat, and then they send them down, to the South to fight on the front. So the North had a huge advantage there where they could just have, these fresh infantry. I mean, they weren't very good. They weren't very trained, but who was really back then? So it really it really worked out well. So the British idea was, okay, we'll just bottle up that and seal off the ports to where the new troops can't get in. Oh, it was brilliant. It would have totally worked. And you're thinking, wow, well, if they had this all cinched up, why didn't it happen? Why didn't the war go the way it did, and why doesn't the British Empire run the United States right now? Why aren't we just a part of the British Empire, which again would have changed the world and world history as we know it? Well, that's where it gets weird because that's where we kind of delve into a little bit of myth and legend. But I believe the story wholeheartedly because it's one, they didn't fight, and they should have. They were set up to fight, so why didn't the British enter the war? Why aren't they here now? Why isn't there a British flag flying now? And that the story goes that Abraham Lincoln, the northern the people at power at that time, they weren't dumb. I mean, yes, a lot of politicians are dumb, but the people at the highest levels, at least they know the moves that are made on the board, and they saw this coming. They was like, holy smokes, the British might actually get involved here, and we're going to be in trouble. They will lose. They know this. There's a really good chance that they are going to lose, or at the very least, the United States is going to be in such chaos for the next, I don't know, 10, 15 years that they're not going to be able to. The sense of power and the infrastructure is not going to be the same as it was. So they were desperate. And, how many allies the United States have back then? Not that many, not that many with a military. And so the story goes that Abraham Lincoln contacted the Tsar of Russia, and he sent him a thing, sent him a letter, and the Tsar of Russia got it. He did not open it. He waited until his chief of, all the chief of staffs were with him at the big table, and he said to them he goes, before I even open this, know that whatever Lincoln requests in this letter, I will do. And so he opens it, and it said, very simply, keep Great Britain out of the war. That was it. And Russia, doesn't do anything for free, but they didn't have to do much in this case because the Russian military did have a sizable navy back then. And I still firmly believe, and we'll get into this a little bit before we end this thing, is that Russia is our secret brothers at the highest level. I think they've always been there for us. And so what happens? Um, Russia contacts Great Britain, if you believe the story, and I do. Russia contacts Great Britain. They said, look, you're not getting involved in this thing down there. You're not going to enter the American Civil War. If you send your ships, we will send our ships. And then, oh, talk about your drama and intrigue. There's your first World War right there. It wasn't at the turn of the century. It would have been 50 years earlier. It would have been the United States and Russia, or I'm sorry, the North and Russia versus the South and Great Britain. Oh, what an epic fight that would have been. Because the Russian Navy and the British Navy would have canceled each other out. Plus, Britain would have had the threat of, the Russian Navy actually going to London if they didn't have enough ships, and start, cannonballing the shoreline. That would have been really, really interesting. Uh, I mean, you can imagine like Russian ships going down the Thames River. I can't even imagine the damage that would have been. So anyway, so Russia contacts Great Britain and they say, you get into you start this fight. We're going to be in this fight. And at that point, Great Britain, remember this is their last shot. Third time's a charm, and they had it. And Great Britain said, you know what? It's not worth it. We will, do this diplomatically, and we will influence the United States, of course, which they have, ever since. But we're not going to try to take the whole thing. So Great Britain pulled out. They pulled out the advisors. They pulled out. Sounds like Vietnam, doesn't it? When we left Vietnam to the South Vietnamese, the they pulled out the advisors. They pulled out their navy. They left the weapons and they left the ships that they had sold to the Confederate Army. That much, at least, they gave them. But that was it. The South didn't have a chance after that. The South had no reason being in that war. I mean, yeah, they had the enthusiasm. The 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 general morale of the Southern troops was very, very good going in because they hated the Northerners. But without the industry, there was only so much they could do. The North had better artillery, they had better weapons. I mean, yeah, the British made some great weapons, but who knows how many, how often they could resupply them. So that was it. The South ended up, losing. They were hung out to dry and lost in 5 years, and then the North came down. They just pretty much wrecked the entire infrastructure. Yes, they freed the slaves, and that was the hanging point they they put out there. But you couldn't tell the people. What do you tell the people at that point? You couldn't. Before that war started, you couldn't say that this was a plot by the British to take the United States, uh, because no one would buy it. No one would believe it, right? It would. It's not the easier motivation. The easier motivation is to do it for honor and do the right thing and freeing the slaves and taking the high road, not defending yourself against the British. Then it gets really weird and confusing because okay, who's on the British side, who's not, and then you also risk the chance of northern states actually being susceptible to British influence, which they didn't want it to. So yeah. There's the whole Civil War in a nutshell. Was it fought over slavery? No, it was the British Empire's last and best chance, in my opinion, to take the whole United States and actually fly a British flag here. And it didn't happen. They tried again. The first time of Revolutionary War, second time War of 1812, third time the Civil War. The whole thing, just fell apart. And there was a little side note before we go. There was something very interesting about this, and that was you keep thinking, well, it sounds like a good story, but I don't know if I believe it. It's like, well, there was an interesting side note to, or say footnote to the American Civil War, which was Yeah, after 750,000 people died and 4.5 years, 5 years of fighting, well, both sides were broke. I mean, the South was decimated, and the North was not in great shape either. They didn't have any money to spend, and yet Russia had them purchase a worthless and very expensive piece of real estate from them. Just literally right after the war. Look it up yourself. Russia decided, oh yeah, we'll call in our debt marker. We did this for you. You get to buy a worthless chunk of land from us, and that worthless chunk of land is now known as Alaska. So, and of course, they didn't know there was oil on it. Had they known there was oil on it, and had they known the political climate in the future, they probably would have left Alaska alone because that would have been so close to us that, I mean, not as close as some of the other stuff they've done, but it was very, very close. So, yeah, why was Alaska sold to? Why did the North agree to buy Alaska from Russia? Even though they could not afford it, they had to put that on a credit card. uh, why they do it is because Russia had done us a favor. Now they didn't even have to fire a shot in doing that favor, but I'm sure they spent a little money moving their navy around as a show of force, just to make sure the British knew they were serious. But that was about it. I mean, they spent a little money, but they made out like bandits in the whole deal. But everything worked out because we got the oil from Alaska. So there you have it. We're going to be doing more segments soon, and thank you very much for listening.